Hello, and welcome to the Academic Center for Writing presentation on writing assessments in the foreign language classroom. This presentation was written and narrated by Jason Schneider, writing specialist in the ACW. When it comes to writing and assessments of writing, these components must be in mind because an assessment across the board may not be meaningful whether students have mastered a particular skill. When creating an assessment for writing, we might want to think about what we are assessing in students' writing. When we assess students' writing for performance, we should ensure that these three things can be met. The first one is that we want students to be able to do the assessment, and this includes proper time allotted for the student to do the task given. When we say authentic, we want to determine whether students can actually perform outside of the classroom and outside of any artificial task that we might make just for inside the classroom. Essentially, we want to know whether students can use and write with their second language outside the class and after the semester, ultimately. Lastly, performance of students' writing should be rated by qualified judges, obviously by an instructor, but we should keep in mind that we might bring other instructors in to the classroom to rate students, since not all instructors are not alike or know precisely what is being assessed. And continuing, what we should keep in mind, have students rate each other in peer assessment too. We can assess second language writing using essays, interviews, and reading tasks. What distinguishes task-based language assessments is that the student must complete the task and therefore receive an evaluation based on the task that the student just performed. Concerning an integrative assessment such as dictation, the student listens carefully and writes a short passage as the dictation is read aloud 3 times, with or without pauses. An item can be either something specific from a writing rubric that we look for in students' writing or a question that requires a written response from a student. Each item should not just be there so that an instructor can turn in a grade, but should tell us, the instructors, and the students what an assessment of this item means concerning the student's skills pertaining to writing in their second language. An assessment of each question should indicate something pertaining to some skill being evaluated of the student. However, what if we have several items for the student to do that pertain to the same skill? Well, this shouldn't be the case just to make an assessment seem rigorous or because it's long, but give the student several chances just in case they happen to make an error, not because of the lack of a skill. As the teacher progresses scoring short responses, the goal is to have an answer key that the teacher can quickly decide whether the student has answered an item correctly without having to modify how scores are decided while scoring short response items. One possibility is to give partial credit for criteria assessed for each item. However, like all other aspects of scoring short response items, any partial credit weighting of criteria scheme must be clearly thought out and delineated before scoring starts so that backtracking and rescoring will not be necessary. When we say task items, this essentially means that these are items that the student must complete to show whether they can perform a certain task in their second language. Here are some things that we need to keep in mind when creating task items. Remember, these items are probably all throughout the rubric. An important thing to keep in mind is whether the student knows and understands what the task is. This requires the task to be clearly defined, given the allotted proper time, be transparent in regards to scoring, and reflective of particular skills being assessed. Here's a holistic version of a rubric. A holistic rubric has several advantages, such as quick to assess and comprehensive of the skills being assessed as a whole. Holistic rubrics are useful assessing exam papers. Here we have an analytic rubric. Analytic rubrics are good for assessing individual writing assignments and letting students know how they perform for each item on the rubric. However, having too many items can be overwhelming for the student to keep in mind what is being assessed and difficult for the instructor to grade. These are probably best for in-class assignments, any kind of writing assignment, essays throughout the semester, but for possibly an exit exam, maybe a holistic rubric would be the better choice, possibly. Self-assessments and peer assessments are good alternatives for assessments typically graded by instructors. These kind of assessments can serve the student as a way to reflect on what they have just done. However, we should keep in mind a few specifics regarding self-assessments and peer assessments. Concerning what is being assessed will determine whether we should have students use holistic or analytic rubrics. Keep in mind, too, that the rating scale should be fairly simple for students to use to get the best out of the rubric. In addition, students should understand the rubric clearly enough so that any assessment is fair and accurate as possible and reflect the skills of the students being assessed. A good thing about rubrics is that other instructors can use them to assess a class other than their own too, depending whether the rubric is clear and reflective of what is being assessed. Brown defines conferences as any assessment procedures that involve students to visit the teacher's office alone or in groups for brief meetings so that the teacher can assess students' abilities to perform particular criteria and or give students feedback. These are some concerns pertaining to conferences as a way to assess students. This can be important to think about in any case that a student is required to come in either at an appointed time or walk in. Just like items on a rubric or a question prompting students for some written response, conferences should serve as a meaningful item to be assessed too. This might pertain to how often students show up, involvement, and work brought to the conference. Just like conferences, there's also concerns about portfolios. Well, concerning who will take responsibility in the second question, it should be established who will be responsible for the process of assembling the portfolios and organizing and keeping track of the portfolios. In regards to meaningful work in the third question, this can mean that students select particular sets of drafts, such as first draft, second draft, etc. And portfolios are really good for writing because we can see the process of writing. We can see where they went from. Could be from brainstorming to their first draft, and hopefully eventually to their polished paper. And like I said, this could be an essay or it could be short responses to questions. Moving on to something now a little bit more technical concerning the item facility analysis. An item facility can tell us a lot without being too complicated in the math. An item facility analysis can tell us how difficult an item that is being assessed really is. However, an item might differ in difficulty for various reasons, which we'll discuss here shortly. Let's say that we have scoring from 0 to 4 on a rubric. Then let's say that most students average between 1 and 2 for a given item, such as a specific grammatical construction that we are looking for in their writing. This can indicate a couple of things. Either students have not mastered that grammatical construction and need more work on it, or something happened or didn't happen during instruction, which could have involved distractions or not enough explanation over grammatical construction as a variable. But essentially what we're going to do is really simple. We take the sum of student scores on the item for all students, and then we're going to divide that by the total number of students responding to that item. And that should tell us the difficulty of that item. Just to keep this simple and intuitive, let's say that we give a maximum of 1 point for a particular item being assessed, such as the present progressive in students' writing. If the average assessment among all students for this item ranges between 0.30 and 0.70, we might assume that this item of assessment is not too easy, and that students are given something that's maybe well beyond, that's not too hard or too easy. If it's too easy, it might be well beyond their level. And if it's too hard, maybe they're not ready for it. However, if most students were to average between 0.90 and 1, we might conclude that there is something wrong with what we are assessing, such as these students require something up to more of their level, or there is something wrong with the way that this item is being assessed. Conversely, we can say something similar if students were averaging between 0 and 0.20 for an item, too. Possibly, the item being assessed is not good for their level, thus being extremely hard, or that again, there's something with the way that the item is being assessed. However, we typically want to see these item facilities between like a 0.30 to 0.70. If you get about 0.50, that's pretty good because it's telling us that the item's not too hard, but it's not too easy. It's meeting right in the middle. But anytime we start going above 0.60, 0.70, we then have to kind of wonder, is this an appropriate item in difficulty to give to our students? And vice versa, if it's below 0.20, we have to wonder, are we giving something prematurely that they're not ready for? Again, we have already discussed this briefly, but knowing an item facility from student scores tell us whether they have mastered that item and the appropriateness of an item by the difficulty of the item. And just kind of talking about what this says is that if we know the item facility from the student scores, we can kind of see whether, like I said, if it's too easy or too hard, so that gives us some idea about their mastery of the content. But also it can tell us whether these items are useful and appropriate for these students. So if it's too easy, it may not be appropriate, and it may not be that useful for telling us much about what these students are mastering. However, if it's really hard, then we might want to think about exactly about the items that we're giving our students to assess them. That maybe it's not appropriate for their level. The difference index tells us essentially, well, in other words, from Brown's definition of difference index, knowing that the difference index distinguishes the students who have mastered the content from the students who have not mastered the content. Notice that we need to know an item facility to determine a difference index. This is good to determine whether students in a class have mastered an item. This can be helpful to determine how much more energy and time might be needed to work on mastering a particular skill without wrongfully assuming whether students need or do not need to continue doing any more practice on a given writing assignment before any high-stakes assessments are given. Typically, when analyzing the difference index from the scores of students, there should be a change from a negative score to a positive score from the difference index. If we find a -1 or something close to that, we should really wonder what is going on, because it could be that the student is undergoing something outside of the classroom to the point that they aren't giving any attention to how they are performing in class. Besides that, the case of amnesia is the only explanation. Essentially, let's say that the student starts, they get a difference index of, say, 0.50, but then at the end of the semester, you see that they get something like a -0.90, or even, at worst case scenario, -1. We really have to wonder what happened. That means, because what that indicates is that they didn't learn something. In fact, actually, it's the opposite of learning. They actually forgot everything. That's really worrisome. But that can be an indicator that there are other variables and factors going on that's disrupting the learning process, and also using their second language when it concerns writing in the classroom. The difference index can indicate the answer to some of these questions. The benefit from a difference index analysis is that we might determine that we need to adjust something during the time teaching a particular skill, or find what is not clear to the students. It could be that the material used in class is confusing the students. Just to quickly reflect on what we've discussed, try to answer some of these questions for your own understanding. However, reviewing and unpacking some of the given information, there is a -1 to 1 possible range for the difference index. A positive difference index indicates that students show a good understanding of the material and have mastered what has been taught. A difference index close to 0 indicates that students have not mastered the material. So if they start the semester, let's say around -0.15, and they end the semester about -0.15, that tells me that they didn't learn anything, but also they didn't lose anything, and intuitively that should be the case. A negative difference index means that they have performed worse than when they first began, which could have been the result of poor instruction or confusing material. So it could have been maybe confusing material that misled them, or that maybe they misheard you. So it's kind of good to kind of reiterate maybe some things in classroom too, to prevent this. Now, looking at the B index, this is telling us, well, in other words, the B index indicates the degree to which the masters, students who passed an assessment in this case, outperformed the non-masters, students who failed an assessment on each item. B index is derived from the item facility for students who passed the assessment and minus the item facility for students who failed the assessment. So when we see item facility pass, those are the students who passed. Item facility failed, those are students who failed the assessment. And this should give us a clear indication of how many are passing and not passing. The range of B indexes is between -1 and 1, +1. But closer we get to 1, that's the best. So that's ideal. But if we can get 0.40 and up, that's pretty good. Basically what this is telling us is whether the students are learning anything. So if we get something kind of confusing on a difference index, we can use a B index as well to kind of see, and this is probably best used at the end of a semester, but we can kind of, and even maybe in the middle, so maybe midterms and finals, but we can kind of see really how much learning is taking place, and we can statistically show this. So the significance of the B index. Well, the logic behind this is that if more failing students are excelling on one item than the passing students, then we might need to speculate that there is something wrong with the item we are using to assess our students. Furthermore, the B index can indicate how effective each item is for distinguishing masters from non-masters over particular knowledge or skills. Another thing to keep in mind, we should consider whether the item being assessed are really reflective of what we're trying to assess. This sounds simple, but there can be other factors interfering, such as something within the prompt that should be a part of maybe another prompt or question because of the skill it elicits. So reviewing what we've just discussed, the range of B indices should be between 0 and 1. A positive B index indicates that we have a good item for assessment. An item with a low B index close to 0 should be revised, and anything below a 0 should be discarded and brought back to the drawing board before using it for any assessment. That's why I said that the range really should be between 0 and 1. If we get anything below a 0, then we really just need to discard it and start over again. And here we can also look at the distribution of scores of students, and this can kind of give us an idea too about the knowledge and skills. So administering diagnostic assessment initially should show a positively skewed distribution, whereas an achievement assessment of writing should show a negatively skewed distribution. So when we look at before instruction and after instruction, we can see the differences between the skewed distributions. This is what a distribution of scores should look like before and after instruction. Typically, at the beginning of a semester or at the beginning of teaching a new skill, we should see more of a positively skewed distribution, and at the end of a semester, a negatively skewed distribution. Thanks for watching. For questions about this or any other writing topic, come and visit the Academic Center for Writing in room W114. If you're interested in more, we can talk about reliability and validity of writing assessments in another presentation. Thanks again.